In this video, we're going to talk about subjects. So what are subjects? Subjects are another reactive extension primitive, some sort of thing that you can use, take advantage of in your workflows. And what they are, put simply, is they're an object that is both an observable and an observer. They are often used to bridge non-reactive code with reactive code. And there's many different kinds of subjects. We can use the straight up subjects. We can use them as proxies as well, which we'll see an example of. And we can use straight up subjects, other subjects, async subjects. We have replay subjects, behavior subjects, and so on. And I find use for them generally in, like I said, bridging non-reactive code with reactive code. I do really want to point out a big warning, though, in this video. And there's a big debate going on, has been going on forever in the reactive world about when it's appropriate to use subjects. And the general consensus is you should only really consider them as a last resort when you're using them in the context of bridging non-reactive and reactive code. The reason for that is often you can get away with not using them if you think about the problem a little differently, think more reactively. So they can be a crutch, and I want to point that out to everyone. But they're also very useful, and we'll see a couple uses of them in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to come over here to my source server, and I'm going to create a new file called example04subjects.js. I do have my gulp task running, so it is being compiled. And then I'm going to go ahead and run it. So I'm going to run build example04 subjects. And let's wait for that to build, make sure everything works, and it does. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull over our imports from previous files, so I don't have to type them out. And we're ready to get started. So basically, let's look at the simplest way we can use a subject. Const simple equals new Rx subject. And then we can say simple.subscribe, create subscriber, simple. And remember, I said subjects are observables, and they're observers. So not only can I subscribe to a subject, but I can also control it. I can say simple.next hello, simple.next world, simple.complete. And of course, we're not seeing any output because I spelled this examples_04. So make sure that you did do that. That threw me in a loop. Yeah, make sure that you spell these correctly. So it is example_04. That's the one that we were running. And unfortunately, there was already an example04 in my build folder that wasn't cleaned out. So another reason why, or a reason why you might want to consider in your gulp task doing a clean on every watch. Anyway, the point is that is a subject. And what we see here is we instantiated the subject, we got our next, and our complete. We basically just took the whole idea of an observable and we flipped it around, right? Because previously when we created an observable, we had to create our generator function that invoked the next and complete methods from within that closure. But with this, what we're doing is we're creating something that both produces values and can be subscribed to at the same time. Let's take a look at another example of subjects, something that you might see commonly. Remember, the subjects have methods called next and complete, which is not an accident. We can actually subscribe a subject to another observable. So for example, I can say const interval equals new Rx observer or observable interval 1 second. And then I can say const interval subject equals new Rx.subject. Then I can say interval subject dot subscribe to interval. I am going to go ahead and oh, what's that complaining about? Functions with lowercase name. Oh, because I'm doing new. Derp. I'm going to do a take 5 on this just to make sure it doesn't go on forever. And then I'm going to say interval subject, and I'll explain this in a second. Subscribe, create subscriber, sub 1, sub 2, and sub 3. Hit Control S. Oops, I did it backwards. Interval should be subscribed to, or interval subject should be subscribed to interval. Easy mistake to make. So now we get next 2, next 1, and so on and so on. Let's make this example a little bit more interesting. I'm going to say window set timeout function, and I'm going to do on 2 seconds, and then I'm going to do this, I don't know what to call it. Look at me. So watch this. I always do that as well. So 0, 1. Look at this. Look at me next 1. Think about the implication of that for a moment. We know that observables are lazy. We know every time we subscribe to an observable, it goes ahead and creates its own thing. So in the case of interval, when we subscribe to interval, it creates a set interval. And it runs it, and then it disposes it when it's done, right? Well, now think about that. Think about how many things are actually subscribed to interval. Well, I can show you the answer right there. I can click on it, and we have the only one instance highlighted. Interval is only subscribed to once. It's subscribed to by our interval subject. So interval subject is now acting as a proxy for another observable. And what that means is when I subscribe to interval subject multiple times, even delayed, I'm not creating another subscription to interval. I'm only creating a subscription to interval subject. And the implication here is huge. We're sharing the same timeout, and we can prove it by look at me. He doesn't get value 0. He only gets value 1. I mean, hey, if I turn this into 3 seconds, you'll notice. So we get that, and boom. Now he only gets value 2 and value 3 and value 4, but he doesn't get value 0 and 1. So we see that we're kind of creating this bridge. We're proxying a subscription with a subject. And that's one use of subjects. Another use of subjects could be to kick off a workflow. So for example, I might say const current user equals new Rx subject. And then I can say const transformed equals current user dot, I don't know, map u goes into u dot is logged in. Actually, I'll change this transform to is logged in. And then I'll go ahead and say is logged in, subscribe, create subscriber is logged in. And now I can go ahead and say current user dot next, and I'll say is logged in is false, and then I'll say window dot set timeout 2 seconds, current user next is logged in true, name is Nelson. Now when I save this, of course we get an error because I did window dot again, didn't I? All right, is logged in is false, and then is logged in is true. So you see what we're doing is we're kind of creating this pipeline where we have this current user, and we're creating an is logged in transformation, and we're subscribing to that transformation. But in the future, for other reasons, for whatever other reasons, we might want to kick off that workflow again. And we do that by manipulating the subject, by telling the subject, hey, you got a new item. And that goes through and applies the entire pipeline and notifies all of the subscribers. So that's a way we can use subjects. Now, this is sort of starts to get into, you really should start thinking about, you know, where does the current user come from? Does it come from a notification from the server, from Socket.io thing? Or maybe it comes from something else. This is a situation where you might want to start thinking, could I accomplish this without using a subject? But if you can't, well, here you go. This is an acceptable solution. But there's a problem here. If I do set timeout, not window set timeout at 1 second, and I go ahead and make that actually not be a syntax error, and I'll go ahead and do another subscription, and I'll do delayed, right? So we get is logged in next false, and then we get is logged in next true, then we get delayed next true. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on is this delayed subscription to the user is not producing a value. And that could be problematic. Because our is logged in, we would very much like it to produce a value to every new subscriber. Because that subscriber needs to know whether we're logged in at that point, but it might not have been listening the entire time, so that data is now lost. And this is an example of this. This starts to come into a discussion we're going to have about hot versus cold observables. So keep that in the back of your mind. But this causes a problem. We have this shared sort of observable, which produces values whether or not anybody's listening. And if a person isn't listening when a new value comes in, it has no way to get the old value. So how do we fix that? Well, fortunately, the awesome people over at Reactive Extensions anticipated this. And they have multiple kinds of subjects. For example, they have a behavior subject. So behavior subject. And that's not how you spell behavior. Oh, it does. The biggest thing about the... what's it saying? Behavior subject is not a function. Yeah, I'm just misspelling it. Come on. I always get the I and the O mixed up. Okay, so the behavior subject, we did get an error. And the error is because of the nature of the behavior subject. The behavior subject expects you to pass in a parameter. And that parameter represents the initial state. So let's do that right now. We'll say is logged in as false. And then we'll run this again and we won't get that error. So now what do we get? Well, first of all, we got is logged in next false twice. Why did we get it twice? We got it twice because of how behavior subject works. Behavior subject takes in a parameter as its initial state. And then every time you call next on it, it saves that back into its initial state. And then when you subscribe to it, it produces that next value. And it'll produce any subsequent values. So that's why isLoggedIn.next gets invoked twice. But if I moved this subscribe underneath the .next for our current user, we'll only get it once. But also look at that. Did you see that? Let me up my my limits a little bit. I'll put 3 seconds on that and 1.5 seconds for that. Watch this. In 1.5 seconds, delayed.next false came in. We didn't emit another is logged in false. That's because the second that this subscribed, it got the previous value that was passed in. So that's a behavior subject. It's great for these sort of circumstances. But what if you wanted to remember multiple values and have them emitted? So let's go ahead and say const replay equals new Rx, not surprisingly, replay subject, and we'll pass in 3. And I'll do replay, that's not how you spell replay, replay.next 1, and then 2, and then I'll say replay.subscribe, and I'll pass in create subscriber 1, and then I'll do replay next 3, 4, 5, and then I'll do another one. I'll do .2. So what do you think the output of this program is going to be? Let's hit save. So we get 1.next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we get 2.next 3, 4, and 5. So if I did a 6 after here, you'll see we get 1.next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's because 1.2 were saved because it didn't overrun the buffer. This parameter that we pass into replay subject is the amount of items it's going to replay when a person subscribes. So it's keeping track of up to 3 items. So there's 2 items here. And then we subscribe. We get those 2 items from our subscription right here. And then these 3 items get also passed into this subscription. But then when we subscribe here, we only get the last 3 items, which are these 3 items, which is why 2 still gets 3, 4, and 5. And then when 6 is called, notice both 1 and 2 get it. All right, so that's the behavior subject. And the behavior subject acts very similar to the replay subject if the replay subject had 1 as its parameter. The difference is that the behavior subject takes in an initial state. So the behavior subject always emits a value, whereas the replay subject would not emit a value if we didn't previously buffer up items. All right, let's talk about the async subject. The async subject is for synchronous operations. So let's say API call equals new rx.async subject, and we'll do API call next 1 and API call subscribe create subscriber 1, and we'll do API call next 2. And now I'm purposely leaving in an error, not an error, but something that's non-trivial or unexpected here. I'll talk about it in a second. And then in 2 seconds, we will subscribe to 2. So that wasn't very exciting. Nothing happened. Well, nothing seemed to happen. We see that the process did pause for 2 seconds, but we don't see any output. Reason is the async subject, what it does is it will only emit the final item before it's completed. So let's save it out. So we get 1 next, 2 on complete, and then when we subscribe to it again, we get 2 next, 2 next 2, and then 2 complete. So the async subject will just sit around, and you can call next all you want. You can call next 1,000,000 times all you want. It's not going to do anything until you call complete. And when you call complete, 2 things are going to happen. First of all, it's going to emit the final item that was pushed into it to all of its subscribers. And then it's going to store that value so that when you subscribe to it again in the future, even if it's already completed, that final value will be admitted. So the async subject is specifically for asynchronous operations that you might be doing. Now, there are better ways to handle asynchronous operations than the async subject, but it's there if you absolutely need to use it. Anyway, so yeah, I know you guys are going to be in love with subjects, but remember, use them sparingly, use them carefully. If you can get around with not using them, that's usually better. What you should think of is you should think, where is my data coming from? And then you should create an observable workflow that hooks into those sources. Using a subject allows you to get around that and still take advantage of reactive features. But again, if you can get away with doing it the reactive way, that's generally better. Things like current user are an example of something that could very well be appropriate in the context of subjects. That's a good example. But maybe it's not if you have a socket.io program that emits your user account every time you connect or every time your account changes. In that case, instead of using a current user behavior subject, we could say current user equals Rx observable from event, and then we would do something like socket emit, and then we would filter out, or socket not emit, we would do socket like login, and that would be our current user. So think about where data is coming from. Sometimes you can get away with not using subjects, sometimes you can, and stuff and things. But that's subjects. In the next video, I want to actually go over a bunch of resources for reactive extensions. I want to talk about the source code. I want to talk about some other resources you can look at. And those resources are going to be invaluable when we get into the next section, when we talk about all the awesome operators, or a lot of the awesome operators we can use. And we'll see you guys then.